Hi, everybody. Dana Sparks, Director of the Real Estate Academy of America and qualifying broker of Maximum One Greater Atlanta Realtors. Continuing on today with our series on the changes that the Georgia Association of Realtors has made to the 2023 GAR contract package. I want to just briefly touch on one of the changes they made regarding the brokerage disclosures in the purchase and sale agreement. Please check out all the videos that I have done on many of the other changes to the 2023 GAR contract package, and check out the playlist 2023 GAR contract for lots of videos on the changes they have made. Additionally, the Real Estate Academy of America is offering free 3-hour CE classes on these changes. They are being taught virtually. They are being taught in person, hosted by a number of Maximum One realty brokerages throughout the entire state of Georgia. And they are being taught by our brokers, by our instructors, as well as by closing attorneys. So please check out the link below and sign up for a class. We'd love to see you in a class. In the meantime, let me talk just a little bit briefly about a change that GAR had made in the purchase and sale agreement, again, regarding brokerage and agency. So this is in F201, the purchase and sale agreement. It is under paragraph B10, where it talks about the brokerage relationships within the transaction. And in response to this hyper-competitive market we have been in, and actually this has been a market we've been in for a while, where an agent may have, a broker may work with both sides of a transaction without it being dual agency. So let me read you what it says in there, and then we'll talk a little bit about what all of this means, as well as some points of practice. So again, in the purchase and sale agreement, F201, paragraph B10, brokerage relationships in the transaction. It states, under agency disclosure, no broker in this transaction shall owe any duty to buyer or seller greater than what is set forth in the brokerage engagements and the brokerage relationships in real estate transactions act. That's Georgia law that we lovingly refer to as the Beretta Act or Beretta laws, OCGA 10-6A-1. It goes on to say no agency relationship. Buyer and seller acknowledge that A, they are not being represented by brokers in a client relationship. If they are not being represented by the brokers in a client relationship, meaning they have not signed either a seller brokerage agreement or a buyer brokerage agreement, then they are each solely responsible for protecting their own interests, and that the broker's role is limited to performing ministerial acts for that party. And now here's the addition they are making for 2023. B, if the same brokerage firm is representing one party as a client and working with the other party as a customer, the broker and all of the broker's affiliated licensees are representing the client. And then it goes on with the consent to dual agency regarding if the broker is acting as dual agent in the transaction, that the buyer and seller both consent to the same, and just the dual agency disclosure that is disclosed throughout a myriad of the forms. So how would this situation happen? In this situation, well, let me go over the types of agency first, then I'll give you a sample, and then I'll give you some hints of what to do. So just a brief review of agency. There is single agency where the public has signed a separate brokerage agreement with the broker, and the broker has a client relationship with that party. In Georgia, the client relationship is contractually driven. So a seller would sign a seller brokerage agreement and a buyer would sign a buyer brokerage agreement. That document thereby creates the client relationship with that public person and the broker. Dual agency is legal with disclosure and consent, but you as an agent, you must check with your broker's policy. There are many brokers that will not allow for dual agency, even though it is legal with disclosure and consent. Dual agency means the broker has a client relationship with both the buyer and the seller, and there's only one agent working with both sides. So one broker, one agent working with both the buyer and the seller, and both the buyer and the seller have signed a brokerage agreement with that broker. That's dual agency. Designated agency is one broker and two agents. And the broker has a client relationship with the seller. So the seller has signed a seller brokerage agreement, and there's one agent working with the seller. And the broker has signed a buyer brokerage agreement with the buyer, and there's another agent working with the buyer. So one agent, one broker, two agents each have signed with the buyer and the seller, each of whom have signed a buyer of brokerage agreement. The way to think about this and where this term came from, because all contracts belong to the broker. So the public buyer and public seller have chosen to work with the broker. The broker has then designated agent A to work with the buyer and designated agent B to work with the seller. We know in actuality, agents typically create their own relationships with the public, but nevertheless, on paper, that's where the term designated agency comes from. Now, you need to check with your broker's policy, but it is possible to have both sides of a transaction without it being dual agency. It can be very tricky, but it is possible, and it is not dual agency. That would mean a broker has a client relationship with either the seller or a client relationship with the buyer and a customer relationship with the other party. So how would that happen? That could happen very easily, and having both sides could easily turn into a potential dual agency situation. So let's say that the agent is working with a seller, and the seller signs a seller brokerage agreement to become a client of the broker, and then you get a sign call. And that buyer is, you've asked them if they're working with a broker. They say no. You confirm they are not. You have no reason to believe that they are party to a brokerage relationship with another broker, brokerage agreement, and you choose to work with that buyer wants to buy your listing that you have signed. Well, you already have a client relationship with the seller, and you may work with that buyer as a customer without it being dual agency. That buyer simply does not sign a buyer brokerage agreement. Again, it can be very tricky, and I would suggest that you check there are many brokers that have a policy against an agent working with both sides. On the other hand, it could be that you have a buyer brokerage agreement, and let's say the buyer wants to go buy a for sale by owner. Well, you already have, or your broker has the a client relationship with the buyer by virtue of they have signed a buyer brokerage agreement, and they end up working with they want to go buy a for sale by owner, and that for sale by owner has not signed a seller brokerage agreement, so they are a customer. So license law requires that if we are working with a public and a client relationship, they are required to sign a brokerage agreement. There is nothing in law that requires a public person sign any document if they choose to work with you and your broker as a customer. However, I strongly suggest that you make sure to disclose to them the nature of your relationship so they are clear as to what that relationship is. So GAR has Form F116 for the buyer's agreement to work with a buyer as a customer. And if you are going to, and that would be what a buyer customer would sign to describe the relationship. And if you are going to work with a seller as a customer, for example, for sale by owner, the seller would sign the authorization to show unlisted property, which is F107, and that describes the customer relationship between the brokerage and the seller. So a couple of points on this. So you could have both sides, not dual agency. Number one, get your broker's permission. Make sure your broker condones it. Number two, I suggest as an instructor that even though it is not dual agency, I suggest you go about treating that as if it were dual agency. Dana, what do you mean by that? I suggest you disclose and get consent from both parties, even though your broker is only the relationship with one is as a client and one as a customer. I strongly suggest you make sure the parties understand what that means and get their written consent to proceed having both sides, even though it's not dual agency. And I was going to say another point of practice. But anyway, that's what I would do. Now, it could very easily potentially turn into a dual agency situation. Let's say you have a listing, so you have a client relationship with the seller by virtue of them having signed a seller brokerage agreement. You get a signed call. The buyer's not working with another broker. They see the house. They don't want to buy it. And at that point, you say, well, you know, I do have access to everything listed in the entire state of Georgia. I'd love to work with you to help you find the house that will suit your needs. And you have a discussion with that buyer, and they sign a buyer brokerage agreement with your broker. And so now you have a client relationship with this buyer. You go and show them other houses, and they come back to you and they say, Dana, you want to know something funny? Remember that house where we first met? I've been thinking about it, and I believe I really do want to go back and buy that house. Well, what do you do now? Now you do have a brokerage relationship, a client relationship with both the seller and the buyer. So that would be a situation where it didn't necessarily start off as a dual agency situation, but it could be that way. You need to get with your broker, see if your broker's policies allow for that. Get consent and disclosure if your written consent and disclosure, if your broker does allow that. If not, then I would get with your broker and find another agent in your firm to work with one party or the other and turn it into a designated agency situation if the public agrees to that. And get with your broker on how to handle that. There's all sorts of ways to handle that. I don't want to go into all of that right now. Just wanted to briefly talk about it while we're here and to point out to you the reference that GAR has made, Georgia Association of Realtors has made in 2023, adding a reference to a broker having both sides of a contract working with one party as a client and one party as a customer. Thank you so much for watching. Dana Sparks, Director of the Real Estate Academy of America and a qualifying broker of Maximum One Greater Atlanta Realtors, satisfying your needs with service, innovation, and education. Bye. If you like that video, check out the one here. If you like the content on this entire channel, please click here to subscribe. I try to take even the most complicated of real estate situations and make them crystal clear. See what I did there? Real estate made crystal clear. Thank you guys so much for watching.